Hello, everyone. This is Jason with Divine Frustrations, and today I wanted to talk about a somewhat controversial topic, and that has to do with the imbalanced views that seem to be represented regarding the life of Charlie Kirk. And I address this topic with some hesitancy, in part because of just the consequences that some people have been facing as a result of addressing this particular topic, in what is supposed to be a free country with freedom of speech. But I guess at the same time, it's just a reminder that we do have to be careful about what we say, both privately and publicly. But what I want to do is to try to provide a middle ground approach between what I see as somewhat two extremes when it comes to reflecting on the life of Charlie Kirk. So, on the one hand, what we see is a lot of people within the Christian community in particular, and all of the attention, all of the focus is going on how much Charlie stood for truth, how much he spoke out against the evils and sins of the country and the world, and how he talked about the way Jesus changed his life and how he was a Christian and born again. And, that needs to be taken seriously. I mean, if that is what he's professing and that is what he strived to live by, then it shouldn't be disregarded. But then on the other hand, you have people on the opposite side who are saying that, well, his supposed Christian experience and his supposed Christian life didn't actually reflect a lot of the things that he said, publicly, and a lot of the things that he stood for, especially with regards to a lot of the negative comments that he made about African Americans in particular, and in a blanket way, not just focusing on specific sections of the African American population, but also just making some blanket statements. And a lot of people have had some real problems with that. For example, there was a video clip where he made a statement along the lines of, if there was a black pilot or something like that, to that effect, he would wonder if he was qualified, and a number of other things that he said. I even recently heard a video where he's calling Simone Biles a sociopath for not participating in the Olympics, and, saying some other critical things about her, which wasn't necessarily, racially motivated. It was more so about his concern over her representation of the country. But the overall point is that there are a lot of people who had a lot of concerns about things that he was saying, not so much about the culture as it was more so about his stance on African Americans in particular, and regard him as a racist. And then you have other people on the other side regarding him as a martyr and just someone who stood for truth. So what I think is important is to think about some lessons that can be learned from Charlie's life as it pertains to the Christian community, because those are the ones who are commenting the most, it seems, on his life and on his legacy. So, from the Christian community who focuses almost exclusively on Charlie's legacy as a man of God and as a Christian, even an apologist, it's important to remember that, it's not just about standing for truth that matters. It's the way we go about doing so, and you may be familiar, for example, with the passage in 2 Timothy 2:24, where Paul says the servant of the Lord must not strive, must not be quarrelsome, which is commonly understood as being argumentative, but to be gentle to all, to be kind. And, I think if we're honest, we could say that that was probably to some extent lacking, with Charlie Kirk as it pertains to his approach, even outside of the content. And it is important not just what we do, but how we do it, because character does matter. And there's a way to stand for truth in a godly way. And then there's also a way to stand for truth in an ungodly way. And so we do have to be mindful of that. Apologists are aware of the passage in 1 Peter 3:15 that state, yeah, you must always be ready to give a defense, but it says do it with gentleness and respect. So what is communicated there is that God is not just concerned about our defense. He's not just concerned about our stand for truth, not just concerned about what we say, but how we go about communicating. And that's an important part to think about as we look at these two extremes or two perspectives on the life of Charlie Kirk. On the other side, I think it is important that, yes, there's a sense in which some comments were made, some stances were taken against certain people, and a lot of people were offended by those statements. And it could be argued that they had a legitimate basis to be offended by a lot of those comments that were made. But it is also important to remember that, we're all growing. At least many people are. Not everyone is growing. But, for those who are, it takes time. It takes, we're in a process, on a journey towards growth. And, it could very well be, yes, despite the fact that there are a lot of things that were said, disparaging comments made, it's possible that had Charlie survived, that over time he would have gotten to a point where he realized that, he said some things that were not in his best interest, not in the best interest of the Christian community or the nation for that matter. And maybe he would have apologized. Maybe he would have revised some of his views on some things. So it's not necessarily proper to just focus on the negative statements, because he was someone who took a stand for things that were right biblically. I know one of the things that I appreciate about him is his stance against abortion and how he went about, defending the rights and the lives of the unborn. And, that is something to appreciate, and everything else that he talked about that was relevant to the Christian life. It shouldn't be dismissed purely on the basis of some comments and statements that he made that were regarding race relations or, things of that nature. So, the point is that on both sides, it is important to, consider the lessons that we can learn, and so I already suggested that one of those lessons is that we need to be careful how we communicate, what we communicate. And then on the same side, we also need to be willing to give the benefit of the doubt as it pertains to the growth process that we experience. There are probably times where even in our past, we might have said things or held to certain positions on things, and we later changed our mind. I know that was the case with me. And because that's part of the growth process, we're still learning, we're still growing. And it's important to, be willing to sometimes extend grace, when someone is in the public view. That's another thing you have to be mindful of. Charlie had a lot of courage to be public with his views and, take the stances that he took. And, even though, there were a lot of people that said that he was saying things he, shouldn't have been saying. And, there's also a sense in which, him being educated, there is that warning that knowledge puffs up, that sometimes the more we learn, the more right we think we are. And, that can lead to pride. It can lead to, some other character challenges in terms of our delivery and our presentation. But, he was learned. I remember him saying in one of his video clips that he reads about, 100 books per year. And, that's something to appreciate, because it showed that he cared about his own personal education. He cared about his faith. He cared about his country. And, even though there were some things communicated here and there that were not to many people's liking, there is balance that we need in assessing the life of Charlie Kirk. So my hope is that we will take the lessons that can be learned, about his life, appreciate the good, and ultimately, again, just hope that somehow something good will come from his tragic assassination. Pray that his, family will heal and will be comforted. And, ultimately, like I said, something good will come from this tragedy. And, we'll just continue to honor his life in whatever way we can. Thank you.